There are $80,000 in a folder on a lawyer's desk and a 40-year-old recipe sitting in a refrigerated truck outside Cincinnati. My brother Marcus taught me to roll the dough the way my mother used to. Palms flat, a quarter turn each time, no rushing. He died 2 years ago this month. His wife Diane sold that recipe 9 months after his funeral without a single phone call to anyone in the family. She signed the papers on a Tuesday. I found out the following Friday. By the time you finish this story, I need you to understand something about family businesses. They don't run on the food. They run on the agreement that the people who built them will keep showing up for each other. When my mother died, my brother inherited a promise. He kept it. Diane didn't. And the thing she lost sitting on 120 white chairs in a vineyard outside Santa Rosa wasn't money. It was the right to say the recipe was hers. Accommodsi, this isn't a story about money. It's a story about a woman who thought a piece of paper could buy her a new family, and a woman, me, who decided to let her find out, in front of everyone, what that paper could not give back. My name is Vera. I am 41 years old, and I have worked in my family's restaurant, the Marigold Kitchen, since I was 12. My mother opened it in 1987. The front window still has the hand-painted lettering she paid a neighbor $40 to do. The booths are the original red leather. The kitchen is the size of a small garage. The menu has not changed in 38 years. Almost everything on it depends on one recipe. The broth my mother used for her chicken and dumplings, learned from her grandmother, and that took her 6 years to write down. The recipe is not a list of ingredients. It is a way of paying attention. You cannot make it in a hurry. You cannot make it while arguing with someone. You have to stand at the stove, fan off, and listen. My mother used to say the broth tells you when it is ready. It changes pitch, from a low hum to something almost silent, and you have to be in the room to hear it. I am telling you this because in 22 days, I am going to serve that broth at Diane's second wedding. I am going to serve it in front of her new husband, her parents, my father in his good navy suit, and roughly 90 other people who are about to watch a woman realize, in real time, that she made a bet she could not cover. Here is what I need you to hold in your head. First, my brother did not die rich. He died owning half of a restaurant that does not, in a good year, clear $200,000 in profit. Second, Diane did not sell the recipe because she needed money. She sold it because she wanted to start over, and the recipe was the only part of the marriage she could legally touch. Third, the company she sold it to, Heartland Provisions, has a clause barring any member of the original family from preparing the dish in any public or commercial setting for 12 years. Fourth, the wedding is on the same vineyard road my mother used to drive past on Sunday mornings. I did not choose this. When Diane called 4 months ago and asked if I would cater her rehearsal dinner as a favor, my first reaction was no. My second was no. My third was something I did not say out loud. I said yes, the way you say yes to a doctor who's about to do something painful but necessary. I had a question I could not answer any other way. The question was not whether Diane had done a terrible thing. I knew that. The question was whether she understood what she had done or whether she had told herself a story in which the recipe was just a recipe and the money was just a number. I needed to see her face. I needed to see it in a room full of people who knew her before she did this. And I needed to see whether the broth would tell her. You are going to be in that room with me. We will walk through the months that led to the wedding and then through the dinner itself, course by course, until the moment Diane picks up her spoon. I am not going to tell you what her face does. I am going to describe it. And then I am going to tell you what I did next, which is the part of the story I have never told anyone until now. One last thing. If you have ever been in a family that fell apart over something everyone said was small, a piece of land, a recipe, a sentence at a funeral, this story is for you. I have read enough of your comments to know that. I see you. I am one of you. Let me take you back. October 1996. A kitchen the size of a small garage. A woman in her early 30s, my mother, who does not yet know she is going to die in 2017. A boy of 9, Marcus, on a wooden crate so he can reach the counter. A girl of 7, me, on the floor, with a wooden spoon I am not allowed to use, watching. My mother's name was Margaret. Everyone in town called her Marge at the restaurant, but I never did. She was not a tall woman. She had small hands and a habit of tasting everything off a wooden spoon that had been in our family since before I was born. She opened the Marigold Kitchen in 1987, the year I was 5. I remember the smell of the place on a Tuesday afternoon in February, which is the smell of butter, browning in a pan, and celery being cut on a wooden board, and the soft sound of the radio in the back, set to a station that played only classical music because my mother said rock and roll made her cut her fingers. The broth recipe was not hers. It was her mother's. Her mother's name was Ada, and Ada had 4 children, a husband who drank, and a kitchen with no electricity for the first 11 years of my mother's life. Ada made the broth on a wood stove. When my mother asked for the recipe in 1979, Ada said, "You watch me once, and you will know it." My mother watched her twice and did not. She brought a notebook on her 4th visit, and Ada got quiet. She said, "I will tell you when you are ready." My mother was not ready until 1985, when she was 29 and pregnant with Marcus. The recipe was a sequence of decisions taken in real time over 6 or 7 hours about how much heat, how much salt, when to skim, when to wait, when to add a single carrot at the end. The single carrot mattered more than anything else in the pot. My mother wrote the recipe down over 6 years and rewrote it and cooked it 140 times before she was satisfied. The notebook is still in the kitchen drawer behind the wooden spoons. When I was 7 and Marcus was 9, my mother let us help. Not really help. Stand nearby. Marcus got to stir from a wooden crate. I got to hand her things from the floor. If I reached for the stove, she would say, "Vera, not yet," when you can see the top of the pot without the crate. The thing I want you to understand about my mother is that she did not love the broth more than she loved us. She loved the broth because it was a way to feed us, to teach us, and to keep the people who had come before her alive in the room. Every time she made it, she was making it for my grandmother Ada, dead for 15 years, and for the woman who would come after her, whoever that was. The broth was not a possession. It was a position in a line. You stood in it for a while, and then you handed it on. My father, Walter, never cooked. He was a high school math teacher who could balance a checkbook faster than anyone I have ever met and could not scramble an egg. He sat at the counter every night and ate what my mother set in front of him without complaint, and after she died, he kept her stool in the kitchen for 9 months before he let my brother move it. That is a different kind of love. It is the kind of love that sits inside a recipe and keeps the chair warm. Marcus was the one who took over the kitchen after Mom died. He was 23, with a business degree and a job offer in Phoenix that paid real money, and he turned it down. He told me, on the phone the night after the funeral, that he had been thinking about it. He said, "Vera, the recipe is the only thing I cannot replace." I drove up that weekend and helped him open on Monday. I have been working there ever since. My father took a half retirement. He came in 3 nights a week, set tables, talked to the regulars. For 9 years, between 2008 and 2017, the Marigold Kitchen ran the way my mother had built it. Marcus at the stove, me at the register, Dad at table 6. The same menu, the same hours, the same broth. The restaurant did not get rich. It did not get famous. It got known the way a place gets known in a small city, by being there every morning at 6 when the work crews came in, and by being the place where, if your grandmother died, you could call Marcus at 11 at night and he would put a container of the broth on your porch. That is the place my brother's wife walked into in 2014 when she ordered a bowl of chicken and dumplings on a first date. I am going to tell you about that date because it is the only time in this story I am going to say something generous about Diane Whitfield. She came in alone, she ordered the bowl, and she cried into it. Marcus saw her. He walked over and said, "Bad day." She said, "My mother just got diagnosed." He sat down across from her with a cup of coffee. I am telling you this so you can see what I saw when I met her, 4 months later, at a cookout in my father's backyard. She was quiet, kind to my father, remembered my mother's name without being told, and when Marcus walked in, she stood up straighter, the way you stand up when you want to be seen by someone you have decided to love. I thought, this one is going to stay. Marcus dated Diane for 14 months before he proposed. I know the number because he told my father on the phone, and my father is a man who counts things. 14 months, the longest he had ever dated anyone. The shortest was 3 weeks, a girl named Rachel who used to send him paragraphs at midnight and then go silent for 4 days. He did not say that about Diane. Diane was a school teacher, 4th grade. She had a small classroom at Lincoln Elementary on the east side of town, and she kept a fish named Bernard and a class rabbit named Pepper, and she wrote her students' names on the board in cursive every Monday morning because she said the act of forming the letters made them feel seen. I want to give you this about her because in a few chapters, I am going to start describing her in ways you will not like. And I want you to remember that the woman I am describing was, at one point, a person who wrote cursive on a chalkboard because she believed it mattered. She was 31 when they met, and Marcus was 29, and the age difference came up exactly once. Diane said, "I am older than you," Marcus said, "by 2 years." She said, "By 112 days I have counted." He laughed, and I am telling you he laughed, because my brother did not laugh easily. Diane was real to him from the first bowl of soup. I will be honest with you about something. I was slow to warm to her. My brother had been the man of the house for 9 years at that point, and I had been his partner in the kitchen, and I was afraid, in a way I had not put into words, that whoever he chose would be a person who took him away from the recipe. I did not say this to him, I did not say this to anyone, but I felt it, and it made me quiet around Diane for the first 6 months, in a way I'm not proud of. She noticed. I will give her that. She did not push, she just kept showing up. She came to the restaurant on Sundays and learned how to roll the dough, badly, and I corrected her grip, and she let me. One Sunday in November, she asked me in the back, while the two of us were alone, if I would teach her how the broth was made. I said no. I said it before I thought about it, and the moment I said it, I knew it was the wrong answer, but the answer was already out. She nodded and said, "Okay, when you are ready." It is the only time in this story I am going to tell you Diane Whitfield used the exact words my mother used to teach me. I do not know if she knew that. I think it was a coincidence, and the coincidence is the most generous reading of her I can offer you. They got married in May 2015 in my father's backyard. Diane did not want a church wedding. She said churches made her feel watched. My father said, "The backyard is fine, we can put the chairs in 2 rows, and I will stand at the end and do the thing." He meant officiate. He had been deputized for the day by a judge he knew from a poker game. He was nervous for a week. He read his lines out loud to my mother, who was not there, in the kitchen after closing. There were 41 people. My father wore the navy suit he had bought for my mother's funeral and had not been able to wear since. Diane wore a simple cream dress she had found at a thrift store in San Jose. Marcus wore a white shirt and dark pants. The broth was served at the reception, in a large silver pot my mother had bought in 1994, and the guests were quiet when they tasted it, the way people get quiet when a thing they did not expect to feel is suddenly in their mouth. Diane cried at the toast. She cried at the first dance. She cried when my father gave the speech, which was 3 sentences long and ended with the words, "Take care of him." She cried at the broth. I cried at the broth too. We all cried. It was a wedding. After the wedding, Marcus and Diane rented a small apartment 4 blocks from the restaurant. They were there most nights. Diane graded papers at the counter. Marcus prepped for the next morning. On Saturdays, she would come into the kitchen at 6, and they would make the broth together, side by side. She would hum. He would not. That was the shape of their marriage for the next 2 years. I did not know at the time how much of that was true. I want you to walk through the next year with the same picture of them I had. I want you to see what I saw before the picture changed. I want you to understand that I was not looking for the thing that was wrong. I was looking at a brother who was happy, and a sister-in-law who seemed to love him, and a father who had started eating dinner at the restaurant again, 3 nights a week, at table 6, the same chair, the same bowl. The accident was on a Wednesday. It was not a car accident. It was a fall. Marcus was on a ladder, replacing a light fixture above the back door of the restaurant, the fixture that had been flickering for a year. Marcus was almost done. He had the new fixture in one hand and the screwdriver in the other, and the ladder slipped on the wet pavement, and he fell 11 feet onto the back stairs, and he hit the back of his head on the iron railing. I was inside at the register. I heard Diane scream. I am going to pause here for a second. Diane screamed once, and then she did not scream again, and that is the part I cannot get out of my head. A person who screams once and then stops is a person who has decided in the half-second after the sound that they are going to be the one who handles it. I ran out the back door, and Diane was on the ground next to him, holding his head in both her hands, and she was saying his name over and over in a voice that was almost a whisper. Marcus, 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 and I have never heard a more controlled human being in my life. The ambulance took 7 minutes. I know because I watched the clock on the wall. The paramedics worked on him in the alley. I stood on the back step. Diane stood next to me. She did not hold my hand. She did not look at me. She watched the paramedics, and I watched Diane, and my father came out and stood behind both of us, and he did not say a word. The head paramedic was a man named Roger who had eaten at the Marigold Kitchen every Friday for 9 years. He worked on Marcus for 19 minutes. Marcus was pronounced dead at County General at 4:42 in the afternoon. Diane was in the room. I was in the hallway. My father was in the chapel on the first floor, sitting in a chair, looking at his hands. Roger drove us home. He did not turn the siren on because Marcus was already gone, and Roger knew it was not a matter of speed anymore. The funeral was a week later. There were 217 people at the Marigold kitchen. We had to put chairs in the alley. Diane sat in the front row in a black dress she had not picked out. I had picked it out. She had asked me the day before to choose because she said she could not. I went to a store on 4th Street, picked the simplest black dress they had, and brought it to her apartment. She tried it on and said, "This is right." I went home and I did not sleep that night. Diane did not give a speech at the funeral. I did not give a speech. My father did not give a speech. We served the broth. 217 people stood in our restaurant and in our alley and ate the broth my mother had spent 6 years writing down, and nobody spoke above a whisper. Diane sat in the front row, and she did not touch her bowl. She held it in her lap. I watched her hands. They were steady. I do not want to tell you what I did the night after the funeral, but I am going to, because it is part of this story. I went home. I locked the door. I stood in the kitchen. I did not turn the light on. I stood there for a long time, and at some point I slid down the wall and sat on the floor, and I put my hands over my face. I want to tell you about the recipe in those weeks, because the recipe was the only thing I could do. The morning after the funeral, I drove to the restaurant at 5 in the morning, and I started the broth. I had made it dozens of times, but I had never made it alone. Marcus would taste it at every stage, and he would say, "Give it another 10 minutes," or he would say, "That is it. That is the moment," and I would pull it off the heat. Now I was alone, and the tasting was mine, and I did not know if I had the ear for it. I stood over the pot for 6 hours, and at 3 in the afternoon, I heard the pitch change. It went from a low hum to a near silence, and I pulled the pot off the heat, and I put the lid on, and I sat down on the kitchen floor, and I cried for the first time in 9 days. I called my father that night. I said, "Dad, I made the broth." He said, "I know." He said, "Vera, I tasted it at 4 o'clock. He said, "It is right." He said, "Your brother would have said, give it another 10 minutes. But I'm not your brother. I am saying it is right." After that, the restaurant stayed open. We never closed for a day. People kept coming in at 6 in the morning, and I kept making the broth, and Diane kept grading her papers at the counter on Saturdays, and my father kept setting tables, and the world did the thing the world does, which is keep going, even when you have asked it very politely to stop. For the first 3 months after the funeral, Diane was a person I could recognize. She came to the restaurant on Saturdays and graded her papers. She called my father on Sundays. She kept the apartment they had shared. She did not redecorate. She asked my father about his cholesterol medication. She asked me in May if I had thought about the spring menu. I said not yet. She said, "Take your time." We did the spring menu in June, the same menu my mother would have done. In June, 6 months after Marcus died, my father had a small stroke. He lost the use of his left hand for 10 days, and he could not drive for 2 months, and he had a fog in his speech for about a week. He came home from the hospital on a Friday. Diane was at our apartment that night with soup, and she sat at the kitchen table with him. She just sat with him. I will give her that. She was a person who showed up for the first 6 months in the right way. In July, the change started. I didn't notice it at first. I noticed it the way you notice a draft in a room in the back of your neck before you look up. Diane stopped coming on Saturdays. She said she was tired. She said grading had piled up. She said it was hard to be in the kitchen. All 3 of these were true. I knew that. I did not push. In August, she changed her phone number. She did not tell me. I found out because I texted her on a Tuesday to ask about the apartment lease, and the message did not go through, and I called the new number from her mother who said, "Oh, you did not know." Diane changed her number 3 weeks ago. She said it was for privacy. I said, "Okay." I drove to the apartment that night. I knocked. No one answered. I went home. In September, my father mentioned, on a Wednesday, that Diane had gone to see a lawyer. He said it the way he said everything, in a flat voice, the way a man says, "The roof is leaking again." She told my father, in passing, at the restaurant on a Tuesday night. She did not sit down. She said, "I went to see a lawyer," and my father said, "Okay." And she said, "It is about the lease," and he said, "Okay." And she left. That was it. I am telling you this so you can see the shape of the change. It was not a fight. It was not a door slammed. It was Diane Whitfield becoming, in increments, a person who was less reachable. She stopped being willing to sit in the chair across from us and replaced that with phone calls and short visits, and my father, who counted things, started counting the days between her visits on a small pad of paper he kept in the kitchen drawer. I am not going to tell you I saw it coming. I was operating a restaurant 6 days a week and making the broth on Sundays and helping my father with his medication and sleeping 4 hours a night, and I was not watching Diane the way I should have been. I was watching the broth. I was watching the heat. I was not watching the woman who had once asked me in the back of the kitchen if I would teach her the recipe, and who had taken no for an answer, and who had said, "When you are ready." But here is what I will say. I had a feeling. I am not going to call it a premonition. I am going to call it a feeling, the kind you get in the back of your neck. The feeling was, she is leaving. Not tonight, not next week, but soon. And when she leaves, she is going to take something with her that does not belong to her. I did not know what it was. I thought it might be the apartment. I thought it might be the china set Marcus's grandmother had left. I was wrong about the object. I was right about the direction. In October, 8 months after the funeral, she came to the restaurant for dinner on a Friday. This was unusual. She sat at the counter and ordered a bowl of the broth, and she did not look at me when she ate it. She ate it in silence, and at the end of the meal, she left a $50 bill on the counter for a $12 meal, and she did not wait for change. She said, "Keep it," and walked out. I watched her cross the street. I watched her get into a car I did not recognize, a silver sedan, and drive away. I found out later it was Daniel Asher's car. Daniel Asher is the man she is marrying next month. That Friday in October was the last time I saw Diane Whitfield for a long time. I was not suspicious of her. I was tired. I was running a restaurant alone. I was helping my father learn to write with his right hand. I was sleeping on a futon in the back office 3 nights a week. I did not have the energy to be suspicious of a woman who had lost her husband. What I had was the feeling in the back of my neck, and the feeling was not sharp enough to make me act. It was just there. I found out on a Friday. It was the second Friday in November, around 4 in the afternoon. The lunch crowd had cleared out. I was at the register, and my father was in the back office doing a crossword. The phone rang. It was a man named Gerald Pratt, an attorney in Cincinnati who said he represented Heartland Provisions and who wanted to verify some information about a recipe licensing agreement. He said the name Diane Whitfield. He said the amount $80,000. I did not say anything for what felt like a long time. I am told it was 11 seconds. Then I said, "Who did you say you represent?" He said, "Heartland Provisions." I said, "My brother died 9 months ago." He said, "I am very sorry to hear that." I said, "Are you calling to offer condolences?" He said, "No, ma'am, I am calling about a contract." I asked him to send me the contract. He said he had already sent it to Diane. I said, "My mother wrote the recipe." He said, "Ma'am, the contract is between Heartland Provisions and Diane Whitfield, who's listed as the sole owner of the recipe." I said, "My mother wrote the recipe." He said, "Ma'am, I hear you. If you would like to dispute the contract, you will need to contact Diane Whitfield directly." I hung up. I sat on the stool behind the register. I called my father. I said, "Dad, I need you to come out here." He came out. I said, "Sit down." He sat down. I said, "Gerald Pratt from Cincinnati just called and said Diane sold the recipe to a food company for $80,000. He looked at me. He looked at the kitchen. He said, "Is that a lot?" I said, "For a recipe, it is a lot. For us, it is nothing." I did the thing I had been trained to do in a crisis in a kitchen, which is, I did not move. I sat on the stool for a long time. I called my father's cardiologist. I closed the restaurant early. I drove my father home. I made him dinner. I came back to the restaurant. I sat in the back office in the dark. I did this twice in my life. The first time was the night Marcus died. I thought about my mother, who had spent 6 years writing down a recipe. I thought about my brother, who had turned down a job in Phoenix to make the broth. I thought about the customers who called the restaurant in the morning and ordered the bowl and said, "The usual." And I thought about the person at the other end of the line, who was me, who always said coming right up and who had never in her entire life charged enough for the bowl. I thought about all of this, and then I thought, $80,000. $80,000 is not a lot of money in the way that the rest of the country talks about money. It is not a house. It is not a car. It is, however, more than my brother made in a year running the Marigold kitchen. It is more than I made in a year. It is more than my father made in any single year as a high school math teacher. It is, in other words, more than the entire family had been paid in any single year for the work of keeping the recipe alive in the entire history of the recipe. And Diane had taken that money, alone, without asking, without a phone call, without a letter, without a meeting at the restaurant where she sat down and said, "I am thinking about selling the recipe." I called her on Saturday morning. She picked up on the third ring. I said, "Diane, did you sell the recipe?" There was a silence. The silence lasted 6 seconds, which I also counted. Then she said, "Yes." I said, "When?" She said, "In August." I said, "Why?" She said, "Vera, I needed the money." I did not yell. I said, "My mother wrote that recipe." She said, "I know." I said, "My brother turned down a job in Phoenix for that recipe." She said, "I know." I said, "The recipe is not yours to sell." She said, "Vera, half of it is." There was a long silence. Then she said, "I am going to send you the contract." I said, "Send it." She said, "No member of the original family can prepare the dish in any public or commercial setting for 12 years. I said, "You signed a clause that bars my family from making our own recipe." She said, "It was their clause, not mine." I said, "You signed it." She said, "Yes." I hung up. I sat on the stool. I called my father. I said, "Dad, she sold it." He said, "I thought she did." I said, "What do you think?" He said, "I think you should not call her back tonight." I said, "Okay." I said, "When?" He said, "When you have slept." I did not sleep. I made the broth on Sunday morning alone. The pitch changed at 3 in the afternoon. I put the lid on. I sat on the kitchen floor. I sat there until my father knocked on the back door at 4 o'clock and asked if I was ready to open for dinner. I did not call Diane back for a week. I told my father I was being strategic. He said, "You are not being strategic, you are being a person. A strategic person has a plan. A person is just waiting." I think he was right about me, but I do not think he was right about Diane. I think Diane had a plan. I think her plan started the day Marcus died, and the recipe was the part of the leaving she could make money on. By the time the lawyer was involved, the recipe had become a thing that was not hers anymore in her mind, and the money was a thing that was. I called her on a Sunday, around noon. I said, "I want to meet." She said, "Okay." I said, "At the restaurant." She said, "Vera, I would rather not." I said, "Then I will come to you." She said, "The apartment is not." I said, "The restaurant." She said, "Okay." I said, "Tomorrow night after closing." She said, "Okay." She came at 9:15 on a Monday. The kitchen was closed. My father was at home. I was alone. I had been there since 2 in the afternoon, and I had not decided what I was going to say. I had a list in my head, and I had been adding and removing from the list for 6 days, and the list was the length of a school bus, and it said nothing useful. She came in the front door. She was wearing a dark green dress and flat shoes. She had lost weight. She had cut her hair short. She sat down at the counter on the stool, and I sat on the stool across from her, and I did not offer her coffee. That is the kind of detail you do not think matters, and then it is the only thing you remember. She said, "I am sorry." I said, "For what?" She said, "For not telling you." I said, "That is not the part I am sorry about." She said, "What is?" I said, "You sold it." She said, "I needed the money." I said, "Half of the recipe is not $80,000. Half of the recipe is 0, because the recipe is not yours to sell." She said, "The lawyer said it was." I said, "The lawyer works for a food company. He does not work for our family." Diane told me, in the middle of the conversation, that she was going to be married. She said, "His name is Daniel." She said, "We are going to be married in the spring, in California." I said, "Where in California?" She said, "Santa Rosa." I said, "Why there?" She said, "Because it is far." I said, "Far from what?" She said, "From this." I said, "Diane, did Marcus know you wanted to leave?" She said, "No." I said, "Do you think he would have wanted you to sell the recipe?" She said, "I do not know." I said, "I know." "He would not have wanted that." She said, "You cannot know that." I said, "I can know that." "I made the broth next to him for 9 years." She said, "I am going to send you a check for $40,000. I said, "Do not." "The recipe is not a thing you split in half." She said, "I do not know what else to do." I said, "I am asking you to think about what you did." She said, "Okay." She said, "Are we okay?" I said, "I do not know." She said, "Would you forgive me?" I said, "Not tonight." She picked up her bag. She said, "I am sorry." I said, "I know." She left. I did not walk her to the door. I sat on the stool until the streetlight outside the front window went off at 2 in the morning, and then I drove home and slept for 3 hours and came back at 5. I made the broth. The pitch changed at 3 in the afternoon. I opened for dinner. I served the bowl to every customer who came in, and I said, "Coming right up," and I meant it. I thought about my mother. I thought about the pitch. In the weeks that followed, I thought about whether I was going to do something. I considered calling Gerald Pratt back and asking him to null the contract. I considered going to the press. I did not do any of these things because I am my mother's daughter, and my mother did not raise a person who put signs on windows. She raised a person who made the broth. I waited for Diane to come back and tell me she had thought about it. I waited for her to say, I was wrong. I waited for her to say, I will give the money back. I waited for a year and a half. She did not call. She did not write. She did not come to the restaurant. She did not pick up when I called on the third Sunday of every month until the calls stopped going through. Or, if she did think about it, she decided it was right. I do not know which is worse. I think they are the same. 3 weeks before the wedding, Diane called me. I had not heard her voice in 14 months. She said, Vera, it is me. I said, I know who it is. She said, Daniel and I are getting married in 22 days in Santa Rosa. I said, I know. She said, the caterer fell through. I was wondering if you would consider doing the rehearsal dinner. I said, give me a minute. She said, take your time. I took my time. I thought about it for 6 seconds, the way you think about something you have already decided. I said, yes. She said, really? I said, yes. She said, thank you. I said, do not thank me. I will send you the menu options next week. I will need a final head count 10 days out. I will need access to the kitchen at the vineyard the day before. She said, okay, to all of it. I said, there is one thing. She said, what? I said, I am going to serve the family recipe. She said, Vera? I said, I am going to serve the family recipe. She said, you cannot. I said, the contract says I cannot prepare the dish in a public or commercial setting. The rehearsal dinner is a private event, paid for by a private party, held at a private venue, attended by invitation. She said, the lawyers will... I said, I am not asking for permission. I am telling you. She said, okay. I said, I will need a written statement from you confirming the event is private. She said, fine. I said, thank you. She said, Vera, what are you doing? I said, I am catering your rehearsal dinner. Goodbye, Diane. I hung up. I want to tell you what I did after I hung up. I sat on the stool behind the register. I did not move for a long time. Then I called my father. I said, Dad, I need you to come to the restaurant tomorrow. He said, what for? I said, I need help with the broth. He said, you do not need help with the broth. I said, I need help. He said, with the broth or with something else? I said, with the broth. He said, okay. I said, Dad, I am going to serve the family recipe at Diane's wedding. He did not say anything for a long time. Then he said, are you sure? I said, yes. He said, the contract. I said, I have read it 11 times. It says the family cannot prepare the dish in any public or commercial setting for 12 years. He said, and the wedding is? I said, a private event. He said, your mother would not have wanted you to do this. I said, my mother would not have sold the recipe. I am tired of waiting for Diane to come back and tell me she was wrong, and I think the broth can do what I cannot. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, what time do you want me here? I said, 5. He said, I will bring the stool. I said, the stool. He said, your mother's stool. I said, why? He said, because I think she should be in the room. I planned the menu the way my mother would have planned it, around the broth. The broth is the spine of the meal, and the rest of the menu is a way to get the guests to the broth without shocking them, the way you build a song toward the chorus. I chose a cold cucumber soup, a simple green salad with lemon and salt, because my mother said the salad should never try to be the main event. A roasted chicken with herbs, because the chicken is what the broth is made for. A vanilla panna cotta with rhubarb for dessert, because Diane's mother had said at Marcus's wedding that Diane's favorite dessert was rhubarb panna cotta, and I remembered that. I wanted every element to be the right thing, in the right order, so that the broth would land the way a sermon lands. I wanted the broth to be the last thing Diane tasted before the dinner ended. I want you to understand that I was not thinking of it as revenge. I am going to do something at the wedding that is going to look like revenge, and I want you to know, in advance, that I did not think of it as revenge. I thought of it as a meal that would, at the end, ask Diane a question. The question was not, how could you? The question was, what did you give up? The broth would ask it. The broth was good at asking. My mother had taught it to. We arrived at the vineyard the day before the wedding. I drove, my father rode in the passenger seat. In the back of the car, in coolers, was the broth. I had made it that morning in the restaurant. The pitch had changed at 2:45 in the afternoon, 15 minutes earlier than usual, and I had pulled the pot off the heat and strained it into the coolers. My father had been in the kitchen the whole time, sitting on my mother's stool, holding a cup of coffee that had gone cold in his hand. The vineyard was 45 minutes north of Santa Rosa, in a town called Healdsburg. The owner was a man named Roberto who had been a regular at the Marigold Kitchen in the early 2000s, and who had moved to California to make wine. He hugged me when I arrived and did not ask why I was there, and I was grateful for that. He showed me the kitchen, the dining room under a tent, and the lawn where the chairs were arranged in 214 rows. I walked the space. I stood where the bride would stand. I looked at the view. The view is the kind that makes you want to be married or never to be married, depending on who you are. I set up in the kitchen that afternoon. I unpacked the coolers. I tasted the broth. It was right. I tasted it again from a different spoon. It was still right. My father was sitting on a low stone wall outside, looking at the vineyard. I sat next to him. We did not speak for a long time. Then he said, "Your mother would have liked this." I said, "She would have," he said. "Do you think she would have come?" I said, "No." He said, "Why not?" I said, "She would have said it was too far to drive for a dinner." He laughed. I had not heard him laugh in a long time. The rehearsal dinner was scheduled for 7 o'clock the night before the wedding. 91 people. I had a printed list of names at the kitchen station, and I had written, on a piece of paper in my back pocket, the names of the people I had to look in the eye, which was a shorter list. My father, Diane's parents, Daniel's parents, 2 of Diane's bridesmaids who had been at our wedding in 2015, Roger, the paramedic who had agreed to come as my guest. I had asked him on a Tuesday, and he had said yes, and he had not asked why. The guests began to arrive at 6:30. I was in the kitchen. I was not going to come out. I had told my father this on the drive, and he had said, "You are going to come out, and you are going to stand at the door, and you are going to say welcome, the way you have said welcome at the Marigold Kitchen for 30 years. I said, "This is not the Marigold Kitchen." He said, "You are right. It is a vineyard in California, and the broth is on the stove, and you have to do the door and the kitchen, both." I said, "Okay." So I came out. I stood at the door of the tent. I was wearing a black dress I had bought at a thrift store in San Jose, the same store Diane had bought her wedding dress from, in 2015. I did not know that until I was in the parking lot. I almost went back to the hotel. I did not. I stood at the door. Diane was the first person through. She was wearing a simple white blouse and a long skirt. Daniel was next to her. He is a tall man, balding with kind eyes. He shook my hand and said, "Vera, thank you for doing this." And I said, "You are welcome," and I did not have time to figure out what I meant by it. Diane came through the door. She looked at me. I said, "Welcome," she said. "The place looks beautiful." I said, "Thank Roberto," she said. "The broth?" I said, "Yes." She walked past me, and Daniel followed her. And the next guest came through, and the kitchen was at my back, and the broth was on the stove, and the room was filling up, and my father was at the corner table with the best view, sitting with Roger, both of them drinking water. Both of them watching the room the way 2 old men watch a room when the room contains their whole family. I am going to stop here for a second. I want to tell you what the room looked like. There were long tables with white tablecloths and small vases with white flowers, and candles in clear glass, and the light was the kind of light that comes an hour before sunset in California in May, the kind of light that makes everyone look like they have been painted. There were 91 people in the room, and they did not know what was about to happen. They thought they were at a rehearsal dinner. They thought the food was a meal. They did not know that the soup was a question, and the salad was a question, and the chicken was a question, and the broth, when it came, was the answer. The first 3 courses went the way I had planned them. The cucumber soup came out at 7:20, the salad at 7:45, the chicken at 8:10. I had 2 assistants in the kitchen, a married couple named Tom and Lila who worked for Roberto, and they moved the plates without speaking. And the broth sat on the back burner with the lid on, and the room hummed with the sound of 91 people eating. While the first 3 courses went out, I tasted the broth. I tasted it the way my mother taught me, from the back of the pot. I tasted it at 7:30. I tasted it at 8. At 8:20, the pitch changed. The hum went low, and then it went away. I put the lid back on. I turned off the flame. I stood at the stove for a long time. I want to tell you what I did next, and I want to be very careful because it is the part of the story I have to be most honest about. I picked up a small glass bowl. I put a single serving of the broth into the bowl. I added a single carrot, sliced thin, I added a single piece of flat parsley, which my mother would have said was optional, but which I knew Diane liked because she had said so in 2015 at the wedding in the back of the kitchen. I added salt. I tasted it. It was right. I set the bowl on a small white plate. I walked out of the kitchen. The room was in the middle of the chicken course. Diane was at the head table with Daniel on her left and her mother on her right. She was laughing at something Daniel had said. I walked to the head table. I set the bowl in front of her. She looked at the bowl. She looked at me. The room did not go quiet. I was looking at Diane. She said, "This is not on the menu." I said, "No." She said, "What is this?" I said, "You know what this is." I said, "Eat it, Diane." She picked up the spoon. I stepped back. I watched her. She took the first spoonful. I am going to tell you what I saw. I saw her put the spoon in her mouth. I saw her close her lips. I saw her lower the spoon to the plate. I saw her hand stop on the plate. I saw her eyes change. I'm not going to tell you her eyes filled with tears, because they did not. Her eyes went flat, the way a lake goes flat when the wind stops. The color in her face went away. Her lips pressed together, and her jaw tightened, and her shoulders came up by half an inch. And her breathing changed to the kind a person does when they're trying not to make a sound. She took a second spoonful, then a third. She ate the entire bowl. I watched her. Daniel was looking at me. His face was a question. I did not answer it. Diane's mother was looking at Diane. She had been at Marcus's wedding. She had been at the funeral. She knew. Diane put the spoon down, she said, very quietly. "How did you make this?" I said, "The same way my mother taught me, the same way my brother taught me, the same way I have been making it for 9 months. She said, "The contract." I said, "This is a private event." She said, "You read the contract." I said, 11 times. She said, "I am going to lose the money." I said, "Yes." She said, "You did this on purpose." I said, "No, I did this for a different reason." I said, "Because you did not come back to the restaurant, Diane," she said. "I could not." I said, "I know." She said, "What are you asking me?" I said, "I am not asking you anything. I am serving you the broth." She said, "I can feel Marcus in this." I said, "Yes." She said, "I can feel Margaret." I said, "Yes." She said, "What do you want from me?" I said, "I want you to know what you gave up." Diane put the spoon on the plate. She put her hands in her lap. She said, "I know what I gave up." I said, "Do you?" She said, "I do." I said, "Say it." She said, "I gave up my family." I said, "That is right." She said, "I gave up the recipe." I said, "No, Diane, you sold the recipe. You did not give it up." She said, "What did I give up?" I said, "As the right to sit at this table, the right to eat this broth, the right to call my mother your mother." She said, "Please." I said, "I am not going to forgive you tonight." She said, "I am not asking you to." I said, "Then what are you asking?" She said, "I do not know." I said, "Okay, that is a start." I picked up the bowl. I walked back to the kitchen. I did not turn around. I put the bowl in the sink. I turned on the water. I did the dishes, one at a time, the way my mother taught me, with hot water and a small amount of soap. And I thought only about the water and the soap and the sound the bowl made when I set it in the rack to dry. The morning after the rehearsal dinner, I drove my father to the airport. We did not speak for most of the drive. The road wound back down the hill, and the light was the early light. My father was looking out the window. I was watching the road. I had not slept. When we got to the airport, he put his hand on my arm and he said, "Are you okay?" I said, "I am tired." He said, "Are you going to call her?" I said, "I do not know." He said, "Okay." I said, "Thank you for bringing the stool." He said, "She was there, Vera." I nodded. He got out. He did not turn around. He walked into the terminal. I checked out. I drove to the vineyard to pick up the coolers. Roberto was in the kitchen. He said, "Your broth is something." I said, "It is my mother's." He said, "My mother had a recipe too." I said, "What was it?" He said, "Mole." I said, "Who has it now?" He said, "No one." He said, "Some things are not meant to leave the kitchen." I loaded the coolers. I drove home for 5 hours. I did not turn the radio on. I thought about the conversation at the head table, and about Diane's face when she tasted the broth, and about the contract I had broken, and about the $80,000 she was going to have to pay back. I thought about my mother, and about my brother, and about my father who had brought the stool. Diane called me 2 weeks later. On a Tuesday afternoon, she said, "I want to come back to the restaurant." I said, "For what?" She said, "To sit down." I said, "Okay." She said, "When?" I said, "Not this week." She said, I am sorry, Vera. I said, I know. She said, can we have dinner? I said, at the restaurant on a Tuesday after closing. She said, okay. I said, bring the dress. She said, what dress? I said, the dress I picked out for the funeral. She said, why? I said, I want to return it. She said, it is not the kind of thing you return. I said, no, it is not. Bring it anyway. She said, okay. She said, thank you. I said, do not thank me. Goodbye, Diane. I hung up. I sat on the stool behind the register. I did not move for a long time. Then I called my father. I said, Dad, she's coming back. He said, when? I said, I do not know yet. He said, are you going to make the broth? I said, yes. He said, I am going to need the stool again. He said, okay. I said, I love you. He said, I love you too, Vera. He said, your mother would be proud. I said, I do not know about that. He said, I do. I said, okay. He hung up. I am going to leave you here. I am going to leave you with the image of the stool, and the broth, and the road that goes back to the restaurant, and the Tuesday night that is coming, and the dress that Diane is going to bring back, and the question I am going to ask her. The question is not the one I asked at the wedding, which was, what did you give up? The question I am going to ask her the next time she sits on that stool is, what are you going to do now? I do not know what she is going to say. I do not know if I am going to say yes or no, or when you are ready. I am telling you, I do not know. I have been telling you the truth for the last 11 chapters, and I am not going to make up an ending that is neater than the one I have. What I have is a stool, and a kitchen, and a recipe, and a brother who is gone, and a mother who is gone, and a father who brought the stool and a bowl of broth on a Tuesday night, and a question, and the answer, whatever it is going to come from her. I want to thank you for being in the room with me tonight. The stories you carry are part of why I carried this one to the end. If you have ever been in a family that fell apart over something everyone said was small, this story was for you. I see you. I am one of you. If this one hit close to home, leave a comment below. Tell me about the recipe in your family. I am going to read everyone. If you want to hear another story about a woman who had to decide what to do with a thing her family built, the video on the screen is the one to watch next. Subscribe if you want to keep hearing these. Like if you think Vera made the right call. I will see you next time. Take care of each other.